So, how you doing? It's Jared. Drop points, the all-encompassing blade shape. Now, drop point is just, again, in the name, where the spine of the blade actually drops down to form that point. And it's essential that it has a convex spine, meaning it's protruding and actually dropping down. If it's flat to meet the spine, it's technically either a clip point or a standard point. And so a drop point has that actual curvature, right? And that enables so much variance on the design. I think that's why drop points are so popular, because people have a knife, they have a specific knife design that they like this specific shape, and it's classified as a drop point. This is another drop point blade design here. This is a Spyderco Endura. That's a Benchmade Griptilian. And so there's just so much variance on it. You can see this one here drops down very, very little, but it still drops down to the center of the blade, meeting, actual center line of the blade to meet that tip, right? To actually form that tip. And that's one of the benefits of a drop point, is the actual, you can place, when you're designing the knife, you can actually place where you want that tip relatively easy. If you want it a little bit higher, if you want it a little bit lower, if you want it in the center line of the knife. Traditionally, it is in the center line of the knife. So you can see this here. If I follow, about halfway where that pivot would line up, and you can see that it is a direct line out to the tip of that knife, which makes it very easy, nice for utility, for any sort of stabbing, because, or any sort of penetrating work, any sort of drilling a hole, whatever you got to do, pushing into a box, it's forward. It's all forward motion because the tip is actually out front. But it does cause a lot of stretch in penetration material, depending on the actual design. You can see this one here has got a whole lot of belly and then just a little bit of a drop, and it's almost a flat section there, but it's not quite flat. It is radiused out into a flat section. And so this is still technically a drop point when it's almost on that realm of a clip point, but it's still is technically a drop point. Focus is messing with me right there. And so it enables the tip of the blade to be, again, very variant. It doesn't have to necessarily be extremely thick. You know what I mean? This is a full flat grind. It's got a distant taper on it. That's the reason for that one there. But you can see here, this has actually got a relatively thin point. It's a decently thin, decently narrow point, but at the same time, it's still got a lot more meat in profile here, because if you remember, I was talking in the clip point video, a clip point has it taken off. There's that material actually removed to cause whatever, to actually create, make a piece of paper in here, if that was removed there, this would technically, like that, this would be a clip point blade, but it's still got that material, it's still got that extra metal up top, and more metal just means inherently more strength. And so you've got that extra strength from it being a larger tip, but that doesn't function well for penetration depending on the design, because this is a drop point here as well. But you can see that this drop point, it's very little amount of drop to actually come down to meet that tip. This is a first edge 50/50 survival knife. If you ever sent me to a desert island, this is the one that I want to take with me. Freaking ridiculous knife. You can see this tip here. It still comes down to a relatively thin edge, but it's very fat right behind it. It's a very abrupt angle all the way to that actual flat section of the blade there. And so it's a very thick tip, and that's what they've accomplished by having it come all the way up and having very little drop. You can imagine if they'd started it maybe a little bit further back, or if it actually dropped down at a steeper angle, this taper here would be at a much sharper angle. It wouldn't have nearly the amount of stock thickness that it has behind the tip. And so you've got a lot of ability with the design. I mean, you can do what you want with it. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's just so popular. And it does enable a lot of just inherent strength, just utility for that. It's not the best penetrator because it stretches material. This is a Benchmade Freak right here, but it's an excellent example of it. When I stab this into material, right? I stab this into anything, because you can see the material is actually being forced. It's being forced around the actual belly of the blade because it's got that taper. You know what I mean? It's got that stretch, so it's being forced around the material, right? And so the blade is going to be forced sideways. It is going to be forced down towards the actual direction of the cutting angle. So you're still doing that cutting in two directions thing, except it is mostly around this forward section of the belly. But depending on where your tip placement is, right, it's still going to be a straight penetrator because it's going to move sideways, but it's not going to cant. You're not going to have any angle change in the actual to actually get into material. Like if you're stabbing with a hawkbill or if you're stabbing with a trailing point, something like that, you actually have to hook into the material because you're going to follow the tip, right? Whatever you're penetrating into, you're going to follow that tip. That's where the motion is going to go. And so having that tip up front and in the center of the blade with that drop forming that actual penetration, that actual squeeze into whatever the material is, it still gives you you're going to move this way, but it's not a canted penetration. So it is good for that. It's very controllable. It's just an excellent blade shape, and it's so variant. There's so many differences, and I think that the major difference I would classify on what's the difference between a sheep's foot blade shape, here this is a sheep's foot, and a drop point. And that is actually where the spine meets to actually form that tip, right? Because if the spine comes down beneath the center line of the knife, you can imagine the center line of the knife between these two screws, it coming out right here, and it all the way comes out directly to that tip, right? And so if that tip were down here, if the belly came all the way down and actually met right above this screw, let's say, something like that, something around this area here, you can imagine it swooping off more, it would be classified as the sheep's foot. And I think that's where that variance comes in, along with the clip point. The variance there is the actual, the radius, the convex radius, opposed to flat or indented and actually recessed into the spine. And so it's just, you can do a whole lot with it. I mean, you can do a whole lot with realistically any blade shape, but there's another example of a drop point. This is a ProTech half-breed. Boker Bushcrafter. There's another one. Benchmade 162 Bushcrafter. Just to give you an idea, I've got more drop point blade designs than anything else, just because it's so prominent. There's so many of them out there on the market, and there's a reason for it. It's just an all-encompassing title. There's so many knives that fall under that moniker drop point that I don't know, to say a drop point is your favorite blade shape, I don't think is a proper statement for a true knife nerd, because there's so much variance on it. You can't really classify it in any one specific things, but yet at the same time, you can, because there is an actual definition for it. So, that's it. Y'all have a good one.